We're going to start. All good. There's a small number of us, so I'm not sure how the others will do. Hopefully they'll watch this, because next week is the test. The final test, I'll set it up for Wednesday night, and it'll run, you'll have Wednesday and Thursday to do it. So it's, and it will only be the material up to this week. So I will set that up. And let's get going at this. We're recording. Good.
Is the test just the lectures again, or is it the lecture?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It will be just the lectures again. Yes, good point. Thank you.
Okay.
And it'll be mostly the second half. There'll be some material from the first half, but not much. There'll be like key stuff like interviewing or surveys that really you should have a handle on by now. It won't be so much a technical question, but it'll be that broad thought on what's the value in interviewing, sort of thing. Okay.
And it's similar questions to like the first one, like it's like the same.
Yeah.
Concept. Okay, perfect.
Yeah, it'll feel much like that. So, all right.
Perfect. Thank you.
You're welcome. So the grading, I've spent all day grading. I have done, I've been grading since 6 a.m. the papers. They'll be done today. So I'm tired. I thought as I was finished sitting here and then my alarm went off for the class. Oh, I should have stopped earlier. So I'm not coming right into class exhausted from grading all day. Oh well, life happens. So they'll be up, posted up early later on. So let's get into the material so that we're not here all night, because I'm sure you guys have somewhere better to be than sitting here listening to me. If you've got a thought, chime in. If there's a question on it, anything that pops into your head, I think it's better if you ask than if you don't, or you throw out a comment. Because now we're getting sort of, this is the closer. This is sort of what puts it all in perspective. The whole of the course. So all the course has been the methods. We started out with sort of that overview of what it's about, and then we've done the methods, and now we're going to shift back to more overview stuff. Why does it matter? How do you put it together? So if you remember grounded approach. So from last week, I'm going to do a bit of repeat or go over some of the it's a little bit of a review. So last week we had Goffman talked about the organizational presentation. And remember I said an organization is a group of people together, don't think about it like work. And he talked about essentially institutions, total institution. So the government is a little different again. Most of you, if you're going into if you go like FCSS, if you ended up in social work and children's aid, it's there's regimented, there's a lot of policy around it. It's institutional. If you're a counselor, then you've got a little more flexibility, but if you're a counselor and you join with an association, there's a professional association, you get your designation, then that is going to have a little bit more of an institutional thing to it, because they set the standards. Certainly in justice, policing, corrections, probation, parole, government institutions, very close to total, although not quite total institution. The police to some degree could be seen as that. Jail guards would be that. The early childhood, I said last week, I see that as not for you so much. It's got a governmental feel to it. If you're working in a daycare center with that's tied to the government, you'll feel it. If you're in a private one, it's going to be a little different. But for the children, I think it's going to have that sense of total institution. So the idea in that governmental institution is there's an idea that the dramaturgy, the social interaction people watch, is if you spend time watching it in government institutions, you start to see how people are taking on roles to preserve themselves, preserve their job. It's kind of got a cautious flavor to it. they don't want to get in trouble. So it's avoiding trouble, but it's not that often you see in government that you see people being really helpful. Not because they're mean, they're just kind of looking after themselves, not putting themselves in a bad spot or taking risk. Or so it gets that sense of what they're about. If you watch it, and I do, that's where I get that notion. You just start to say, oh, it's about the individuals looking after themselves to some degree. So how do they portray themselves? What role do they adopt? Do they take the submissive role? Do they take the cashier role? They're sitting behind their desk. They deal with the next person at the window, push the person on to the next. So what's interesting with Goffman is, hang on a minute, where are we at? Do we have 2 weeks left? I'm onto the wrong stuff. I'm supposed to do content analysis, aren't I? Yes, somebody say yes. We're on week 9. I thought we're at the very end. Oh, I got ahead of myself a week. So that's next week. We just did the first 5 minutes of next week. That's good. That'll mean this week will go quicker. I'm going to come back to that a little bit. That idea, so that refresher on what we just did. Hang on a minute. Is it still open there? I had to open a second one and I just realized I undid you. So in that where we talked about the psychiatric facilities, the discourse in it. So the psychiatric discourse, how that presentation rolls. What you've got is, let me see if I can do this. Wait, there we go. You get a self-help flavor. So they used to call it, if you remember Goffman talked about Asylums was his first book. And the people there were called inmates. Now, when he went to presentation of self and everyday life, that shifted a bit. So they're inmates in an asylum. We've shifted it. What do we call them now? Do they call it asylums? No, yeah, no test next week. The test is 2 weeks. It'll be the 27th. So I got ahead of myself a week. Today is the 20th. We have class next. No, today's the 13th, the class the 20th. And then the test will be on the 27th. Too many hours reading papers. I've lost my mind. So if you think about, we call them hospitals, mental hospitals, mental health institutions, still institutions, mental health facilities. It's a shift in language. And this is where discourse starts to come in. Facilities. Inmates. We don't call them inmates. What do we call them now? Patients. Gentler, softer version to it. So think about this. Think about what I described about Goffman last week in the asylums. And we've shifted from asylum to the language of mental health and inmates to patients. So what you get in that is this idea of psychiatric discourse. It used to be, when Goffman was looking at it and wrote his material, essentially warehoused crazy people. That was the language of the day. They were broken. We just warehouse them. We can't do much for them. We can make their life maybe a little easier, but they're institutionalized. That was the language, and that's the way they went. What was interesting with that, when Goffman went, looked, he said, wait a minute, even inside these institutions, you've got this front stage work. But what you realize when we look at the way it used to be, that idea of the institution being asylums and inmates, this whole notion here, what you start to realize is we've changed from this to this. It sounds like we care. They're not inmates like in a jail. They're patients that we care for. They were asylums. It's got an oppressive sound to it. Now we call it mental health facilities. That idea that it's a mental health facility instead of an asylum makes people feel more comfortable with it. Ultimately, though, we still do the same things in those places. They are still locked in. Someone still controls the door. They can't leave when they want. Now, some of them in hospitals, many, have got a little more of a ward setting to it. Pardon me, but you've got your own room, you've got a sitting area where people can come and visit, or where you get out, move around. So it's got a little more sense of being able to do stuff, but there's still people there ready to jump in and stop things if it gets out of hand. So you're being monitored all the time. It is much like a jail in that your ability to decide is still fairly limited. So this shift in language is a shift in the discourse, the way we speak about it, which affects the way we think about it. And that in turn affects the way we respond. We aren't concerned about mental health facilities. We don't think we're concerned about caregivers in a mental health facility. We have to worry about people in asylums abusing their authority, like worrying about it in the jail or in the police. We have to worry about that abuse of authority in asylums with inmates. But when they're patients in a facility where we care for them, well, we don't need to. You don't need to be so concerned about them abusing their power because they're doing nice things, and that's false. Flat out false. We have to be as concerned today as we were then, but the language makes it feel safer. That's discourse analysis. It's an analysis of the way things are discussed. It is not just what is said, it's the manner in which it's presented. Pedagogy is a big deal. The way we teach, it's a big deal in ECE. When you look at, so Foucault and Derrida was a significant debate in the 70s, and they talked about pedagogy versus breaking out of that postmodernism, really, but it's the break out of, and Derrida continues to, has all the way along said, we need pedagogy. We need to know there's a structure to the way it's done. Well, establishing this as the mandatory structure makes it, we interpret that as the right way. There's a right way to, if you think about the way people talk about stuff, there's a right way to teach. There's a right way to parent. There's a right way to look after patients. There's a right way to look after inmates, or to ensure inmates don't get out. It's so all of that language of the right way, it's important to hear what's behind that use of language. So, and Foucault points us to this idea, and very much I buy into it, the idea that in looking at that statement of what's the right way is my claim to power. That's what it's about. That's what you're trying to recognize when you do discourse analysis. So the language of the psychiatric facility, we don't need to worry about it so much because they're caring, and I'm going to cut at that. We're just going to do those first two slides. That language of caring gets us to not worry about what they're doing. They're still doing the same thing. Nursing homes, nursing, it's caring for old people. I don't know if any of you know anybody that's lived in a seniors home or a nursing home. Some of them are not very nice. Some of them, and from the point of view of the people that are in there, they do not feel free and so much. They're hospitalized, institutionalized. So that language is a big deal. So we'll come back to this again next week, but it's to tie back into that notion of frame analysis. Frame analysis looks at what's the words that people are using, why are they using them? So when we call it discourse analysis, we're looking at the language, that what's it about? Why pick this particular language? So let's shift. Does that make sense of the idea of discourse analysis? It's an analysis of not just what is said, but how it's said. Content analysis, on the other hand, is about looking at the words that are used. It is about looking inside. It is completely from within the frame. You don't look outside the frame. Discourse analysis, if you remember, I talked about the frame of reference I'm not sure if it shows up here. I didn't. If you remember last week, I did the frame of reference on the screen there was the idea of, how do I do it here? Draw, right? The picture frame, drawing a frame. Right, we frame it up. So frame analysis looks at the outside edges, says what's the context of people's activities? What's the things that limit it? Discourse analysis is looking at this piece all around the edge to say what underlies what's going on in the frame. What's the thoughts that are going on? Why is this discussion limited this way? Why are we only discussing it in these particular terms? Content analysis doesn't look at the frame. Content analysis says this frame exists. Let's look at what goes on within it. It is a straight analysis from the inside, just the inside, analyzing the words or the actions. You can do content analysis on a movie. You can do content analysis on a book, the words that are used in a book. So I'm going to give you an example of how it works. Essentially, in content analysis, you're going to pick a topic, theoretical framework that goes with it, potentially a hypothesis. Going to apply the appropriate. How does it work? So let me go step you through it. So here's my frame. I wonder if I can do this and keep it up. So my thoughts on this are Freud, Sigmund Freud. All of you know who Sigmund Freud is, right? Many feminists don't like him. I'm going to suggest that Freud supports feminine. Hang on a minute. I just lost it. I had a kind of a unique one there that I think works. How Freud is going to, Freud is the feminist essentially, is what I'm going to show. Freud as a truly as an early feminist or early proponent of feminism, and let's see how that works. Proponent of feminism. So that's my working hypothesis, my idea. I'm going to come at it from a psychoanalytic background, which is psychoanalysis. That theoretical place is following the teachings of Freud. It looks at two things. So psychoanalysis is my theoretical framework, is to look at early childhood development and to look at how they, in that development process, children grow, and the unconscious that develops in that early childhood phase and then carries with us into adulthood. So that's psychoanalytic thought, and that's my theoretical perspective. Here's my kind of hypothesis. So let's go on, oops, to the next one. Oh dear, pressed a button. Where'd it go? Is the slide still there for you, or did it go missing? Oh, I know. I had to get rid of this. I pressed a button. Oh, sorry. There we are. So let's look at how this would play out. So if I choose a topic, Sigmund Freud. So Freud, if you look up, bring up Freud's volumes, where am I? Let me just pull one. Freud's volumes of work. It is immense. I'm just going to look and see if you can see, if we can see a series. Freud's full set of work. So if you go to here, I'm going to pull this up for you. If you look at how many volumes. Oh, Encyclopedia of Mathematics. That's not the one we wanted. Freud's full set volumes of work. Pull up an image. The Life in 10 volumes. See if I can make that bigger. Now, in those volumes, there are several little textbooks. I don't know if I can make that cleaner. No, I can't. Let me see if I can find another picture to make it a little cleaner. I'm looking for a clean version that you can read. Oh, Winston Churchill. How do you like that? I had the picture and then I lost it. I touched the button. Freud's full set of Freud's volumes. Probably on Amazon. Well, I'll pull one up when we take a break, but we'll look at this one for now. This is good enough to start. So what you get at this point is when you look at these volumes, you've got 10 volumes. In each volume, there are several little parts to it. So in the first set, what he talks about is Freud starts into the unconscious. Now, to understand the discourse, actually, I'm going to come back. I'll just do the content analysis first. So Freud starts with studying where he came from. He was originally a biologist. Like, he's looking in a microscope in a lab coat, and that's who he was. So when he starts to look at human behavior, he starts in the late 1800s. He's following Darwin's theory. This is after modernism. Science has come around. Science has debunked religion. Religion doesn't count. So Freud's work, you can look at the early work and say, oh, his early work sort of gets at the notion of early childhood development. And then you get to a part where it looks at the unconscious, the psychology. What we get to know is, all of you know the terms, right? Ego, superego, id. I'm guessing, or I'm hoping some of you have been exposed to that terminology somewhere in your sociology class. And then his later stuff is sort of philosophy. That's how I would break down Freud's work and say, to frame it up, it frames up as, and these pictures are not accurate, or my selections are not accurate, but it kind of frames up here. You've got 2 and a bit where he's looking at early childhood development. Then you've got several on the unconscious where he gets really interested. And then you got a couple where he starts to shift into sort of it's more philosophical, it's more society as a whole. If you look at these 3 breakdowns, so to do a content analysis on Freud, you might look at all of his volumes of work and you might separate them out this way. Or you might take one book and say, okay, I'm going to do a content analysis on this book. Good. You might take one article and do a content analysis on the article. So what you do, and I think this is good for interviewing, it's a way of thinking about stuff. You read it for what the person has to say. And you read it with that curiosity of, wow, that's interesting. And then at the end, you might go back and reread it, or at the end, you start to think about, wait a minute. And that's when it kicks in the, wait a minute, what about this? What about this? What about this? You do the critique of it, the critical analysis afterwards. Initially, I think it's a longer, slower process, but I think you read it, you skim read it, you get through it quick to get a feel for it and say, where's this person coming from? What are they saying? And then you go back and you do a critique. I think what it sets you up for is a better ability to do research, because you've listened to them clearly, their argument, and then challenged it. If you start off critiquing it right from the beginning, it's a difficult process all the way along. You may not get the full flow of their argument. So to understand what you're doing and why, so content analysis, whether it's an article, a whole book, a series of books, the whole series, or a portion of his work, it wouldn't matter. So his early work gets at the 5 stages of development. And it is, I gotta be able to get rid of this thing. Hang on a sec. I get this thing on my screen that's driving me crazy. So you've got 5 stages of development for Freud, early childhood. Anybody know what they are? Anybody remember? Where's my ECE people? No? Okay. Well, here, I'll throw it up for you then. Just a sec. Let me share this screen. New share. Ooh, I like this. This would be much harder to do in class. So we're not going to analyze them all, but you can see this, right? So the first stage, the oral stage, it is the satisfaction of an instinctual response to a need. Hunger. Your belly is full, no more hunger. But there's the other part that he realizes children just feel good with suckling. It's not about eating anymore, it's just the suckling. Then you get to the anal stage, and think about this part. So that suckling part, this is what's really interesting with Freud is, to read it, I had this image of Freud. I sort of thought he's kind of like the perv guy, right? It's like everything is sexual, everything's sex. And he came up with some later, right? And that's what I'm going to show you. Penis envy is what we're going to get to. But that's the part that I'm going to suggest to you that that's a feminist position, or it's a feminist proponent position. Although most of us would think that sort of, that view that he had, that women have penis envy, want to have what a man has, and it's physiological, was offensive to feminists. I'm going to show you how I think it fits. But so that's my content analysis. That's what I'm going to do, all just within the context of his own words. So he goes to the anal stage. This is his early work. The anal stage, suckling, he realizes children like it. The kid on the toilet, have any of you either have seen small children, work with small children? You've got a kid walking around with poopy pants, right? And they're doing that little walk. They're not giving it up. They're not. And you say, "Oh, everything okay over there?" Yeah. The kid's in the corner, right? But they're not saying, "Oh, I went duty," and they want to run to the bathroom. Eventually, they get there. We teach them to that, but initially they don't. They'll walk around. It's in their diaper. So there's no sense. The sensation of that. There's a control piece perhaps in it when you start to read his work a little later on. But this idea that there's a libido piece to it, it feels good. Now, he's not saying the same as sexual libido for all of us. The idea, it is a piece that physiologically it feels good, and psychologically it feels good. So that's what he's talking about when he uses the word libido. You got to read his material to go through and say, oh, wait a minute, libido is this. It's to talk about it being a sexual pleasure or sensual pleasure. He's early language. But we'll come back to that as discourse. Initially, let's just go through the content piece. So he gets to then the genital part, where that is pretty clear. That is got more of a sense of sexuality in it. The notion of the Oedipus complex, the importance of the mother. Now, this is interesting because when I was learning Freud, my kids were young. And a lot of what I was reading as I read, I said, he's describing what I was seeing in my own kids. So if you think about how you were raised and how significant was your mother, if your mother was an important part of your life in your early years as a caregiver, well, her caregiver role is a very dominant place. Caregiving is not minor at all. And it is, we think of it as caring. We only think nice. Back to the psychiatric discourse. If it's caring, it's okay. Well, caring is very dominant. If you can't eat because without that person who puts the spoonful of food in your mouth when you're 6 months old, then that person is caring for you, but they're dominant. If you think about what's more important, perhaps, or more not important, but more dominant, you've got a child and there's the parent, the mother, the child suckles at the breast. Which is a more dominant position, that breastfeeding mother or the domineering father? Maybe the father that yells or the parent that yells, call it either or. We tend to think of the yelling as a dominant place. We see authority. We think of that. That's clearly a dominant place. But if you take away the parent that is dominant, yells, a child cries when they're 3 months old, the child whimpers or cries, makes a fuss, and a parent yells and the child sort of stops. They learn to stop because of the yelling. If you take that parent away, the child still carries on. If you take away the breastfeeding mother, the child makes a fuss, the mother feeds the child or doesn't feed the child, even the child just suckles at their breast. The child, that nurturing place, that caregiving, if you remove that, the child starves. So it's a more dominant position. And we'll come back to that again next week, but think about that in the back of your mind. So Freud doesn't quite get all of this, but he's early on. But what you get if you look at it, so that's my theory coming into it. This Oedipus complex Freud talks about is the idea of breaking out from underneath the mother's authority. The mother is got a dominant place. It's about getting out of the dominance, getting into a quiet so that you have your own place. That's what I think we're seeing there. So we still haven't got to what I thought. Then we've got the latent period. So there's no sense of sexuality. It's just kind of everything sort of comes. This is boys don't like little girls, right? Think about this. 6 to puberty. Look at the age ranges in these. 3 to 6. The child wants to own the mother, possessive, or dominate. If the child's dominated, even getting out from underneath that caregiving is an element of dominated or not being dominated. This one here, though, this is sort of a point where you get little boys and little girls play with little girls, little boys. They don't like the other one and blah, 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 that sort of stuff. And then you get to the genital stage where now into the teens, this is straight up sexuality. That's Freud. That's his 5 stages. That gets at his early work with children. So we'll leave it at that. That's where he gets to. Now later, so that's in this. Let me see if I can come back to this. Have I lost my annotation? I probably have. Maybe not. I don't know if I lost it. That kind of gets at the wrong one. Kind of gets at this part. So I've done little quick content analysis, blah, blah, blah. But later on, he gets to the ego, id, superego. Now, the ego is the middle of our world. It is the normal place. It is, for the most part, conscious. It is clear all. So you've got over here is the id, and then you've got ego. Oops. And then you've got superego. So, and I sort of see them, I think they're better to look at if we see them on sort of different levels rather than ego here and superego here. If you think of your sociology course, socialization, you get taught to be what you can do and can't do, what's appropriate in your world. The id is the unconscious stuff. We have it. All animals have it. This is instinctual. Now Freud sees us as no different than any other animal. Following Darwin, he sees us as continuation of species. Darwin. He sees the sexual activity as that. So all of our instincts, he doesn't see as any different than other animals. We're kind of the same. The superego that he brings in, to some degree, is essentially socialization. We could call it the church. It's not just the church, but the church is a part of it. But it's got a pretty big piece in it. It's a bigger circle, more influence. So we're socialized to this stuff. We internalize that socialization. So our beliefs, why do we have the beliefs we have? Because we got taught them, or because they are just right? I'm going to suggest that it's because we got taught them. But then he develops, and then he realizes, so in the midst of all this, there's this ego place. And the ego kind of overlaps both. The ego balances the two. On the one side, you've got the id, instinctual stuff. So that is straight sexual drives, sensual, pleasure, eating would be instinctual. And that desire to eat and the pleasure that comes from eating, instinctual. Then you've got the superego over on this other side. Bigger influence, socialized, taught by our family, taught by what's around us, all of what's normal, what we're supposed to do. This balances the two. So this is unconscious. This is unconscious. Some of this is unconscious, and the middle part of it here isn't. This we're aware of. Some of this, though, we aren't. And that's the balancing piece in it. So there's sort of an analysis of what his work is now when we get to the middle part. When we hit here, that's this middle part of his work. That is the work in the unconscious, what it's about. So we get that growing out in his work. So I've done the first stage, now the second stage is work. And in here is where we get this idea of the unconscious, and somewhere in the midst of all of this, he grows this idea of penis envy. So back to my original content analysis, back to what I said I was going to do. I'm going to work through, oops, wrong one. Close that one. Uh-oh. Hang on, what did I do? Oh, here we go. I'm back to here, right? I'm still in my theoretical perspective. So I'm bringing psychoanalysis with this idea that Freud is actually a proponent of feminism. He's an early proponent. So when he talks about penis envy, what he's done is he's gone from biology and he shifted into children and people. And then he's gone into this exploration of the unconscious in the middle of all his work. And when he does this exploration piece here, he gets to this place of, he's now dealing with people. He's seen as a psychoanalyst, whatever they wanted to call it then, a counselor. So he's talking to people with troubles, and he's in asylums. Then he's going in, he's talking to women that are seen as hysterics or hysterical. It's big emotional stuff. It is a motive that he's looking at it. It's not behavioral science the way we understand psychology today. He sees it, I think, to some degree more in emotive terms, and we start to see it, and it manifests in physical behavior, but there's an emotionality that underlies it. But at this point, he started to shift as well to dealing with women that need some counseling. He's talking to women in Europe. They can afford his services, so he's expensive. They have to have money to afford him. So when they're calling on him and he goes and he interviews them and he speaks to them and talks about their difficulties, what he keeps hearing, and he constantly hears from these women, is they're not happy. And why aren't they happy? Because they have tea parties. They're not allowed to talk politics. If there's men there and the men are talking politics, the woman's not allowed to be involved in it. Imagine, and all of you in here think about this that are women, imagine being in the room, you're in the classroom. So we let you sit in the room, but you try and speak and I shut you down. I say, darling, hang on a minute. There's no place, this is no place for you to speak. Be thankful we let you hear, but you just sit quietly. Imagine being treated like that. I'm thinking some of you, I'm hoping that some of you, even me, in the thought of me saying it, it brings you a little bit of angry. It shouldn't be like that. Imagine living like that. You're not allowed to speak. The men are in the other room, they're smoking a cigar. And so when they talk to him as a counselor, what they're saying is, this is horrible. What a terrible existence. My husband votes. I'm not allowed to vote. My husband votes. He votes for who I tell him to vote for. It's the Mary Poppins thing, the suffragette movement. It's women that are in the background that really are, they know what's going on. They're in charge. They're no different than you are today. They weren't less intelligent. They weren't allowed to express it, was the issue. So he hears it over and over again. Well, and so what you get is when you look at his work, and so starting at the beginning, he starts over here, and as he moves across, what you get is this biologist who started with Darwin, and as he works his way across here, he's gone from looking at amoebas in a microscope to children to now adults, unconscious desires, and what he's hearing is the conscious, the ego talk that says, I should be allowed to have a voice. My voice is just as important. It's equal. It should be equal. But he's still stuck in his mindset. So here's where it's a shift, content analysis to discourse. But his content says, when you follow him, you say, oh, the guy sees everything in physiological terms. He's never got out of the lab coat. He's still a little scientist looking at amoebas. So what he sees is the physiological difference. And he says, oh, well, of course, what's the difference between a man and a woman? Well, a man has a penis and a woman doesn't. He doesn't go the converse, which a feminist would say, and actually, no, the men is missing the important part, which is how we have a uterus that we can carry a child in, and he can't. So Freud goes to this physiological place. He sees the difference because he hears these women talking about it. Think about this. Here's the complaints. And what he hears is, I want what they have. There's no reason that just because they're men that they should have this place in society that I'm not allowed to exist in. That's patriarchy. They didn't have the language in the early 1900s of patriarchy. They didn't know that term. It wasn't there. It didn't exist. So they didn't get it. Ultimately, I don't think his head was in it quite this way, but if you look at his work and dissect it, to some degree, you could look at his piece on penis envy and say, this is a guy early on who's recognized the unconscious desire for equality, translated to verbiage, to words, which is a conscious statement of my desire, entitlement to an equal place, social place. Early proponent of feminism? I would say yes. I would say that article could be used to support feminism from a long time ago, as opposed to saying that it was bad, it shouldn't have been. Now, that I've done that by working through an analysis of his work. That's pretty weak. That's pretty superficial. But it's kind of, in looking at it, when you look at what that one article is about here in whatever volume, if it's in this volume, when you look at that one article in this particular text, that one article says this. Well, what's the article saying? When you read the article by itself, I'm thinking, would be offended if you're a woman. If you're a man with any social conscience, you would be offended. If you start to pay attention to it and you look at it in social terms, it might start to understand it. Now, if you take that content analysis, though, and you go to the discourse place, how did he get there? What took him to that line? What limited his ability to talk in better language? What limited his ability to use the language that we use in sociology today? It's because he was new. There wasn't anybody doing it then, that at least that he was aware of. So he didn't have the appropriate language to talk about what today we recognize as patriarchy. Arguably, that is the discourse place that makes sense of why his language, content analysis inside the frame, to discourse analysis, what puts the frame in place, what limited the work. The limits were the language of the day, the lack of social conscience, where he was as well. It's affluent Austrian society, people with money. When you get to his later work, so I've done a content analysis on one little piece here. I've done one article. I put it in the context of the unconscious, which is the middle articles. And then I put it in context of the flow from the beginning up to that point. So still, each of those is still a content analysis way of looking at his work. If you look at his later work, the conscious, or the where you get the philosophy, there are things. Oh, the other piece that's consistent, equivalent, equally as off when you read it as a standalone. I'm not even sure as a standalone. I don't think you can unread it. If you read his piece on homosexuality, narcissism, what he describes in it and the way he puts it, he writes from the context of Middle Europe, affluent Austrian society. Homosexuality is inconsistent with the social norms of the day, and he writes a piece that fits right in with the times. I don't know if you would write the same piece today. It's hard to say. There's a lot of stuff with Freud that is quite off. There's a lot of it that he simply got wrong, but some of it still might be useful. And therein we have, so from him there was a breakout. There's Freud, and he went together with there's several others that are big names in psychoanalysis that get at this unconscious early childhood development piece, different than psychology. So the discourse in the three, psychoanalysis is the idea of early childhood development into the unconscious, wrapped into the unconscious that affects the way we grow up. Psychology just looks at the behavior as it exists. It's not necessarily about undoing some trauma from the past. It is looking at the behavior and teaching yourself to do other behaviors. A discipline, a particular discourse in it. Psychiatry is about brain chemistry. Take the right pill, we can correct your brain chemistry, everything will be better. Your behavior will change, life will get better for you. Psychoanalysis, very much emotionally based. Psychology recognizes emotion, but it's behavior based. So in the three, they are different discussions around what we do without thinking about it. And in those three, they've each got a different discipline. They have there's a discourse between the three of them. Think about discourse too in that. There is this course and the other course. A course and a discourse. It's a different path. It's a different understanding. That's what discourse gets to. Content analysis, it's the nice, tight, closed environment. Picking the words, sorting through the words. What do the words mean? Why are they there? How many are there? In his work, you would look at the word ego and you would see it again and again and say, oh, how often did I see it? So when you go back to is my whiteboard still there? If you go back to this one, these are the three defining categories. You see the words come up again and again. You might do a word count on them and actually see how often they show up. Ego shows up. Maybe I'm going to make up some numbers, but maybe ego shows up 362 times in one book. Call it one chapter, right? Maybe this shows up 481, but this one shows up 732. Make up those numbers. But if you did the word count and you see that this one keeps showing up, it shows up more than the others, that means there's something significant here that you need to pay attention to. That's content analysis. That's some of the word count idea in the categories. You've got these categories that you're following and you're looking because they establish the big things that the writer focused on or that was in the media. If you look at the work of, so let's update this. You could do content analysis on it, do it on movies. I don't know if any of you have seen the movie Get Rich or Die Trying. 50 Cent, you know who he is, right? I hope. You're young enough. Yeah, you're old enough to know who 50 Cent is. So 50 Cent, that movie was first run movie. If you look at it as a social commentary on an underclass, and I talked about this before, as an archive, you start to see categories in his work. If you look at his newer work, I think he's a co-writer, producer of a show called Power, and it's about it's a TV series, but it's about coming up, the rise up of a drug dealer who tries to break from the street and to make it into mainstream economics, but underneath he's still a gangster. So it's got this crossover piece. Well, there's social commentary in that. You can dissect his work in terms of the social commentary and the social class issues that go with him. He grew up as a kid on the street in a terrible and a really hard neighborhood to huge money and affluence. Did he shift over? Didn't he? He's got exposed to two worlds. He's written essentially about that. So content analysis on that, absolutely. What are the concepts? Power is his concept. Money as a means to power. So the way you'd record what you see, what I just said, the word count. How many times you see the word? You actually keep track of that. You compare this sample to that. If you're going to compare Freud's work, that one article, and you're going to talk about the ego work that exists in the middle sections of his books, you're going to draw out a volume, maybe volume 1 and volume 7 and then volume 10, and how often does it show up? You start to compare that actual hard data that establishes what the difference is from one to the other. And here's the standard language of this is where content analysis is like everything else. Your sample, what's your representative sample? Are your samples consistent? Is there a large population? Is there a small population? The library example that you did when you went to the library a few weeks ago, you went and looked. Anybody remember how many books were there? Roughly? Wasn't it like 85,000 books or something? Large population. We looked at a small population to make sense of it. Same thing with content analysis. I drew out 4 articles from Freud's work. I drew it randomly. There's 10 volumes of work. Each book's got 4 to 6 chapters. So there's arguably 30 articles to write. Out of those 30 articles, I came up with a representative sample of 4. I picked 4 randomly. And I saw ego talk this many times. That's content analysis. So it's slow, it's tedious, you're keeping track of what you saw, how often you saw it, what it means. How does the person define it? Not how does society define it, what does the word mean? How does this person define it? Discourse analysis, you're going to compare it outside. Discourse analysis, I'm going to look at Freud's penis envy, Freud's discussion around sexuality, where he got to, and say, this is how he defines it, what it means. When I do the discourse piece, I'm going to say, that sounds like patriarchy. Women who've been subjugated by men. Women who have been pushed into a second class, well, arguably second class place. It depends on how you see it. There are some who would say that staying at home and mothering is not second class at all. In fact, that's the first and most important job for any of us is parenting. But if you go with what we typically see as social status, then being forced, and that's the piece that comes to it, the agency, being forced to stay at home and decide what you're not allowed to do. Getting at that stuff gets at an analysis of saying, okay, back to my hypothesis. I don't know if it's still there in the first slide. It's probably gone. My first hypothesis back here that, yeah, it's gone. So back here when I wrote in the one, right? My working hypothesis, Freud is an early proponent of feminism. There's my working hypothesis. I come back to it. I do my word counts to see if it's consistent, to see if I'm seeing, did it work out? Yes, no, maybe I was wrong. Maybe as I worked through it, I said, ooh, that didn't work out very well. So I've now got that going forward into these, at this point, I'm just describing what I see, straight descriptive work. I haven't done analysis yet. The analysis comes later, after the recording, when I start to do, the analysis comes in here. I start to look at putting my hypothesis together and saying, did it work? Didn't it work? What are the conclusions that come from it? I develop data tables and graphs, which we'll look at a little bit, make sense of what they look like, why they matter. And then, you start to get at this notion of, I talked about it before, historical interpretation. If you look at Columbus, Christopher Columbus. So Christopher Columbus, content analysis on Columbus is he left Europe, his writings, he arrived, he didn't actually get here, but whatever. He arrived in Cuba. He arrived in, I don't know if he got to Jamaica, but he got to other islands, landed in Cuba. He doesn't really settle here the same as what they say. But still, the notion of it, the content analysis is when we dissected it. So in the discourse, that's all good because he's the great adventurer, found the new world. That's the discourse analysis on it. When they did the content analysis on his archives, so they went to the archives, they went and found his writings of his voyages and what he had, his, what was on his, what's called instrument of latency. It's the things that he's carrying on his ship. They did content analysis on that and said, here's the archive. And when you look at the words in that archive, you say, holy crap, he had people on his ship. He had slaves. The content analysis gets us to undo some of that historical interpretation of what happened. When we looked at, when I said about Mandela, Nelson Mandela, an amazing story. When you look at, it is the content of his material that made him important, that got people started to listen. They heard the message was in his content. It wasn't just in how it was said. If you looked at what the discourse was, he's a guy in jail writing letters, whatever. He would have been blown off by the jail guards as whatever. The content of his writings is what gets out to the world, and the content is what makes it meaningful. So when they do that content analysis of his work, and when you look at some other significant ones, so Martin Luther King Jr., that idea that in it they're talking about in jail saying we should treat people better than this. We're all people. We should be in this together. What's interesting is, and when you do discourse and content and you sort of put the two together, you do it either way, both of them outside of jail, both of them in an empowered position where they've got a huge social following, still saying the same words. Their content didn't change. The discourse did, because now they had a voice that people were listening to. So the discourse shifts, although the content doesn't. Does anybody have any difficulties with that? Does that sort of make sense? Yeah, no? Let's break for 10 minutes. Stretch, that's an hour. We won't be very long tonight. I will be done probably about 35, 40 minutes when we come back. But let's break a bit and digest that a bit. See if there's some thoughts pop into your head. And then we'll come back. If you got something else, throw it in.
Are we moving on to the next lecture then?
Yeah, so that's the 9. So I'm going to go back to that 10 that I started into.
Okay.
I'm going to start into a little bit of that, sort of pull them together.
Okay, perfect.
Good? Okay. All right, I will see you in 10 minutes. How do I do this? Stop video. Pull up a picture of the complete works of Sigmund Freud, and I found it. There's the all 5,000 pages of his material downloadable. Wow. See that picture? All right. Oh, there I was talking away to myself. You couldn't hear me. So we're back. So I'm expecting all of you to do better on the exam in 2 weeks than everybody else because you're actually here. So I hope that I'm hoping this stuff is useful because I realize how quiet it's getting online because you don't like the class. So I just did a search to pull up a picture of Freud, the Freud stuff, and interestingly enough, what I get is, oh, that's interesting. I found the whole book, all of his work, 5,000 pages. Wow. You can download the whole thing. But here they are here, the 24 volumes of his work. So that analysis piece I just did, it's pretty hard. Oh, I'm echoing. Okay, thank you. Let me turn down my mic. Is that better? Get rid of the echo? Good. All right, thank you. So what you get here is when you look at this, that full set of volumes, right? You start to get all of what his material's about. And so here's where we start into the Hysteria, Volume 2, early psychoanalytic publication. You can see the biology, the shift in biology, gradually more into the unconscious interpretation of dreams. That comes early and that becomes his thing, but it also becomes when he wrote it. And that's what's interesting here when you look at the download on the material. 1890s, psychical or mental treatment in 1890s. Then we move into, it's 1895, early 1900s. It's turn of the century stuff, where you start sexual enlightenment of children, 1907. So this is all stuff that is seen as a little out there. He's reaching, he's new, he's novel, though, is what he is. So he does an analysis of Leonardo da Vinci, who's been dead for how many years, but he does an analysis. So it's that notion of what are we doing? He's kind of digging through. What he is grounded. He's got a grounded approach. He doesn't know ahead of it. He's going into what he can, like he's digging through new sort of stuff. So let's move on. Let's go back to now the slides number 10 and what I was talking about there. So content, discourse analysis, I worked through that with Freud. Did that make sense to you, the way I stepped through? Not do you think I'm right or wrong, because
No.
That's the point in it. The findings would be arguable. So I tell you my method. My method was to do this analysis of this work, the line of thought that I saw through it, and it ended here. That analysis, now you can argue that back and forth. We'll have different findings. We'll have different views of what it was. That's arguable. But hopefully it's that you can see the logic in my train of thought there. And if you really wanted to challenge it, your best place to challenge it would be to challenge, oh, what have I done? The best place to challenge it would be to challenge the logic, not just the argument at the end, my findings, not just we disagree. No, that's stupid. I don't believe that. It is, well, hang on, you said this and this. So if I do this content analysis, I come to a different position. And that's where you get the debates that go on, that have gone on for years. Philosophy did that. Imagine 100 years ago, 200 years ago, 400 years ago, engaged in a debate with somebody across Europe. You're in England and they're in Austria. You've got to write a letter. So you write a paper. What you do, you write a paper, a 20-pager, a 100-pager. You write it, you send it. It gets ridden on a horseback to the other side. And then somebody reads it, think about it, write it, send it back. It's months in between your writing. That's what you do now on a text, immediately. Content analysis, discourse analysis, yes. The ability to look at media today and recognize the significance of media, what it does for us, it gives us that immediacy in a conversation. How many of you send a text and expect to get a response right away? What happens if you don't? Where did my pictures go? Uh-oh. I pressed the button. I don't. Oh, manage. There we go. What do you expect a response right away with a text, or is it sort of, well, it'll come whenever? You get, okay, good. So you wonder why they don't answer, but you'd be a bit bothered. If it's important, you're going to answer right away. So that's changed the nature of discourse. That is the nature of texting, what we expect. If we get, oh, what was I doing here? Oh, I know what I've done. Hang on a minute. Can you still hear me? Yes, no, yes. Oh, good, thank you. So when you get into that text place, the sense of immediacy, that anticipation you should get a response, changes the nature of the discussion. If you send a message and leave it, so think about when you leave a voicemail, in your head, are you on your sort of pins and needles dancing, waiting for a response, or you've left a message, you'll hear back when you do? Now, it might go a while before you start to wonder, how come I didn't get a call back? But if you call somebody who you know is at work and you leave them a voicemail, your expectation is you hear back later today or tomorrow versus the text. That's discourse analysis. You're looking at the way that the conversation went on, not what the words are in it, not what's the words in the text. Any of you text where you add emojis on your text? Anybody had a text go sideways because you think you're being funny and the other person thinks you're being mean? Yeah. I bet most of you have. So I've learned always little smiley at the end of when I make into a conversation that could matter with somebody, because they're going to interpret it differently. If they're having a bad day, they can interpret my, hope your day. So I might type in the words, hope your day is going well. Think about this. Hope you're, oh, how about this? Let me just type it. That might be better. So you open your phone. So you get up in the morning and hope you're having, what's this? Hope you're having a good day. Now, would that automatically be something nice? Is that a pleasant thought? Or is that sarcastic? Oh, hope you're having a good day. We had a little dispute last night. Maybe you and I had a discussion that didn't go well. So you wake up in the morning to this message. Is it a snarky message that is, I hope you have a good day because I'm still pissed? Or is it, I'm fresh, I'm clean, and I hope you have a good day. So that we're both on the same place. So it would be a normal place to think it's the argument continuing. Now, if I say that with the smiley face, does that change it a little bit?
Yeah.
Could it still be taken as the argument?
I feel like that could also be taken as sarcasm, though.
Right, it could, couldn't it? Or this one, right, starts to get more clear. Oh, is that sarcasm?
Yeah.
So you're better at this than I am. But think about this in your own. So what you're doing with that is content analysis. You're doing it all the time. We just don't put that language to it. But you're looking at what the words are, what's said, and saying, oh. Discourse analysis is that frame piece when you start to put some context, some bigger context to it and say, oh. So what's your frame? Good. What's your frame of mind? Discourse analysis is what is thinking about what the frame of mind might be. So in sociology, for Freud, he called it, or for Goffman wrote it as frame analysis. It is looking at that outside frame. Discourse analysis is that. They're not interchangeable, but at this point, they're close enough for you to grasp what they're about. So let's go back to where we had left off there, where I said about the psychiatric discourse. So you've got this notion of caregiving. It is like the dominant parent, where I said, we think about a mother or a mother breastfeeding an infant as caregiving. It's a loving thing. It is very dominant. In terms of, in psychoanalytic terms of domination, submissive dominant, the child is submissive. The child demands, so the child makes a fuss. The mother complies with that fuss, so the mother is submissive in complying with. But at the point where the mother is feeding the child or soothing the child because of suckling, then that child is now, the mother is now in the dominant place. So it's a shit back and forth. But what's key with it is psychiatry, when we talk about patients, nurses, doctors, caring for them, it's exactly the same thing. It's a disempowering place to be in a psychiatric facility. The psychiatric discourse is care. The reality is it's disempowering. It's a dominant place. Caregiving is a dominant place. So that's sort of what we did. Sort of what we did with that. Now let's look a little bit at what we looked at with Goffman. What I'd had to say about him before. So Goffman gave us frame analysis. So that's a place of reference. What's my reference points? What's going on around me? It includes everything. So it is my family dynamic, where I did that, and that commentary before about my sister and brothers, and there's a family dynamic in that, which is good, bad, consistent, inconsistent. You're getting those variations. That's all included in it. For the most part, if we did an analysis of Goffman's work, like I just did with Freud, you've got, for the most part, his work is ethnomethodological. Now, recognize the difference between ethnography and ethnomethodological. Ethnomethodology, break down the word method. It is methodology, and that is an important piece for us. It is, right, the thing you do. Ethnography is a way of thinking about doing research. You want to get in the person's shoes. Ethnomethodological is participant observation, is interviewing. It's the things you do with an ethnographic mindset. You're trying to understand this group, and this is the way to go about doing it. So his work was that. He was a participant observer. He was an observer in the Shetland Islands, but his big work is asylums, and he's a participant observer. So very much ethnomethodological. You could also look at his work, though, and see it as symbolic interactions. When you review, he didn't go in and say, oh, I'm a symbolic interactionist. When you look at his work, you start to realize that he is a symbolic interactionist. He's looking for symbols. And what happens as a result of those symbols? How are things understood and interpreted between groups? Now, his work and the other theories as well, remember over here, the words in the squares, are societal reaction theories. So this becomes discourse. There is a way of looking at social interaction, and it is this idea of looking at discourse. How do I get rid of that? Clear on. You get this idea of societal reaction theory. So the three big ones for us to consider in research methods are symbolic interaction, which it's the same stuff that you learned in sociology, hopefully. It's stuck a little bit. Phenomenology, you didn't do in sociology, but we'll talk about it. And then ethnomethodology. It is about doing these things. It's a way of looking at doing research. So phenomenology is the idea that you're looking to see what goes on in this group and how do they see things. What are the rules? It very much relies on the language. Churches, synagogues, mosques, temples, wiki ceremonies, it wouldn't matter what you went to. They're a really good example of phenomenology because the language they use in that particular institution or organizations where it's small groups that get together and it's a little more loosely set. There's a language that they use that we could call it ritual, but it's consistent in the language. So that sets it as a phenomenon. If you go in this Sunday, so interesting piece. I was raised Catholic. And so we had prayers that we said every week in church. You stand up, you get down, you kneel, you stand, you kneel, you sit, you stand. So in all of those different positions, you just, as a little kid, you just learn it. That's just what you learn to do, and you just do it. What was interesting is I went to a Passover dinner with friends in my 20s, or your age, and as we're doing Passover dinners, I was reading along in the English text, and I said, hey, this is the same stuff we do in church. And I realized the Passover dinner is not the same prayers, but the sort of the story and what went with it is what I learned as the Last Supper in Christianity is a Passover story. They didn't teach me that. But at some point I figured out and I realized, so I look at the language, and then I look at the language and say, and you start to look, say, Christianity came out of Judaism, how that broke it. So you start to put it together and say, okay. So these people here that follow this language, the set of beliefs, these particular practices, there's a phenomenon to it, and there's symbols that they all understand. You go into any religious building, there will be things on the wall, or the shoes are taken off and they're on a shelf. There are little things that everybody there understands to mean a certain thing. That's phenomenological sociology. It's looking to say, what's the phenomena here? How do we understand it? So given this belief, this phenomena, this thing that it's an overarching piece. It's like a cloud, not clouds. I don't want to think of it as a ominous or bad thing, but it's that idea that when you look out and there's a cloud, the whole sky is clouded over. You can't see beyond it. That's what's there. That exists. That is it. If you're outside, you're going to feel that. That's the idea of phenomenology. And then everything else that exists is underneath it. Whether you run to the car or the bus because it looks like it's going to rain, or whether you walk, or whether you think, look out, ooh, I better wear a bigger coat, that looks cold. Everything you do now hangs in that idea of that overarching thing. Symbolic interaction on the other side gets that individual activity. How do I see myself? It assumes there's a social structure. So phenomenology, social structure sort of develops out of it. But in symbolic interaction, it just assumes it's there. Doesn't matter where it came from. It is just there. And what are the meanings that all these people understand? What are the shared things? A handshake. What do you understand about a handshake versus somebody else? A handshake in some cultures is polite, it's friendly, but you cross from one culture to another. I did, met some people, a friend of friends, and reached out my hand was introduced to a woman, put out my hand to say hello and to greet her. She wasn't too impressed because that symbol was not a symbol that she understood the same way as me. It had different meaning to her. It was offensive to her because men don't touch women. I see it as being polite. So the symbols there weren't shared. How's the interaction play out given the share? They're not shared. If they are shared, the symbolic interaction tries to look for what are symbols that are shared, and then how do we understand the activity given these shared symbols. So ethnomethodology, we kind of got to it. Ethnomethodology is, we're not looking at social structure. We're just looking at what people do. How do they see their world? This is the stand in your shoes place. So we just want to figure out what they're doing, how they're doing it. And we might stumble across some idea of social structure. Society might exist because of this. You could look at two hermits that living in the mountains in Hawaii, or they're removed, or two hermits living on the streets in Toronto with their buggies who bump into each other. They cross each other's paths. Is there a structure? Nope. You would look at each from their own perspective, how they live, what it means. No social structure to it. They're hermits. They are independent and stay separate from each other. So we would see social structure as an accomplishment if they bump into each other from an ethnomethodological place. If you see those two people with their carts moving along the street and they sort of realize they're in shared space, and they work out some kind of arrangement where one's in the bus shelter for the in the early evening and one's in there later evening, or they're there at different times of the day, or they're there different days, or when I see you, you turn left, when you see me, you turn right. Those things become accomplishments, social accomplishments. So that's kind of what we're getting at when you say ethnomethodology, whether it turns into something or not. We're just looking, so it is just looking at the individual. So before we got to those sort of theories, there's sort of a progression. So this gets to the discourse. And so those are all, sorry, those three, and here they are on the left. Societal reaction theory. It is about the reaction of one person to another. We'll come back to that next week, communication issues. But it is about the back and forth. Prior to that, though, we had this discourse on the way society worked out. These people, and it's a development. So we're going to do a discourse analysis here, but you should think about these different steps. You've got this guy Card who comes along and says, they kind of have this idea that, you know what, people learn from following, right? Socialization. Little children behave like sponges. They repeat what their parents do. They do the same thing. They use the same language. All of that sort of stuff is learning model. Tard comes up with that, early 20th century. But then Sutherland comes along and says, wait a minute, there is more to people than just, because sometimes people don't adopt what they use. You've got a parent that curses and swears. I don't know if any of you have got somebody, you've got that crazy Uncle Paul or something. There's that guy you grew up with. My kids had it. So in my house, we didn't curse or swear. Something happened. I think my kids taught me how. But language was an issue. There was no smoking or drinking in my house. But we had friends we used to go visit, and he'd curse, and he smoked. Well, he didn't smoke, but he drank. He drank like heavy drinker, drank his face off. He was pretty funny. So what was funny with it is, he was that funny guy that my kids got exposed to. And on the way home, so they're a few hours away to go visit. What's interesting is on the way home, my kids had talked to him, oh, you know, Paul did this. Did you see that? Oh, in the car, because he did those things that were kind of the crazy guy things, right? He wasn't really. He was a funny, and he's one of those few people I know that when he drinks actually gets funnier, because typically people only get funny for a bit and then they get not so funny. So he would just get funnier, but it would get a little more crass. There'd be some cursing. I don't know if any of you, I'm sure all of you have seen it. He's the guy that teaches my kids the pull my finger trick, right? So it's stuff that is, and they come away giggling. They're 6, they're 7. Did you see that? They didn't adopt it. They didn't adopt it. They didn't curse and swear and do the same thing. So Tard's got this idea that they will, of course they would learn it because they got exposed to it. Well, Sutherland says, no, not necessarily. Many don't. So differential association is the shift outside of. And he realizes, he says, learning is a back and forth process. So they pick stuff up, but some stuff sticks and some stuff doesn't. And it's the impact of how they learn that changes it. Then you got another guy comes along, Glasser, who says, well, yeah, how they learn matters, and it is about communication back and forth. And in fact, that's how deviance grows. He says, at the point when they identify with the other, the non-normal behavior, that makes sense of learning because there's a connection with the way that learning was going on, that it stuck to them. They become, so deviance grows on them. They don't even realize they're deviant. Tattooing would be an example. Tattooing is sailors in 40s, World War II, they all got tattoos. Why? Because everybody was doing it. It became a norm. But when they come back here, their norm is deviant. It's recognized as deviant. You have what? And I don't know if you've seen him, like the sailors get that big tattoo on his arm or all down his leg, and it's like a blue ink picture of a naked woman or something. It's things that when they got back in the 40s here or in England, or they weren't appreciated. You covered them up. They probably got covered up because society didn't recognize them as okay. Society recognized them as deviant. But because everybody else is doing it, they sort of come along and so one guy does it, another guy does it, it becomes normal to them, but then shows to be deviant. So the learning comes out there. Neutralizing norms comes Sykes and Matz that come along and say, okay, deviant, yes. And so this is the growth of it. This is how the discourse works. You've got one person came up with an idea on learning and said that, and because this is how learning works, we should teach children this way. And then somebody else says, well, no, what about this? And then they add on another one. So Sykes and Matz to say, actually, what you get with behavior and with children learning is neutralizing norms. The thing that was deviant becomes normalized, and now we don't really worry about it. Tattooing in the 70s was still deviant. Think about any of you might have tattoos or know people with tattoos or where they have tattoos or what they have. So it's neutralized. No, by the time the 90s hit, nobody cares. 70s, it's still deviant. 70s is piercing your ears, guys wearing pierced ears. One, I can't remember which it was. One was you were gay, one you were straight. And at some point I got two because I said, well, this is stupid. So why wouldn't you just wear two? You buy a set. So that was really weird. Deviant. Now, nobody cares. Tattooing, though. So we go to the neutralizing norms from tattooing in the 40s to deviant, hidden. 70s, a few have it. So you've got people in a drunken moment get a snake on their arm or a rose or something, or a little heart. Butterfly. Butterflies are good. So that went on. 90s, it sort of normalizes. Now I'm thinking tattoos, nobody cares. The neutralizing is where we're at, where nobody cares. Your generation, I think it makes no difference who's got tattoos where, right? We see sleeving, it's all whatever. Differential reinforcement, though, goes beyond just that it's neutralized norms and it's okay. Differential reinforcement makes it a positive place. We interact around it. We have tattoo culture now. You can go to conventions where they do tattoos. I have a friend that's a significant tattoo artist. He travels the world and does tattoos. He's never done a rose or a butterfly, and he never will. And it is about a whole community connected around it. So that's the reinforcement around something that's different or unique or novel. The novelty approach is an interesting piece. If you look at society sort of in terms of on a graph, peaks and valleys on novelty versus where things are sort of accepted as normalizing. So this stuff in all of these theories, social theory grew in this process. So when you look at the discourse, what you see when you look at it as a discourse, you say all of these have the individual as just things happening around them. It sticks to them. They have no part in it. They're just hapless, the idea that they're hapless, determined objects. You just exist and this stuff happens to you, so you learn it, you don't even know anything about it. As opposed to societal reaction, you don't even clue in that anything's happening, maybe even. Whereas when you look at ethnomethodology, so this is a repeat of the previous one, but it is when you look at that in terms of the symbolic interactionism, phenomenology, you have this idea that I'm an individual and I can make choices. I have agency, the ability to decide. So societal reaction gets at this place of looking at the world and saying, it's not as simple as the world went on around me and happened to me. It's not about blaming the world. This societal reaction says, no, it's the interaction back and forth between the individual and the world. My view of myself, even as a deviant person, my view of deviant is a reflection of thinking about what the other, how the other sees me. It's their reaction to me that tells me I'm deviant. And at some point might tell me I'm okay to be deviant. Societal reaction requires the other to be looking at me. It requires the idea of being the object of something else. We'll come back to that next week. But it's the idea of back and forth communication. So if you go to the grounded approach, and we look at Goffman, what he did, so as a discourse, an analysis of his work, he starts with a silence. He goes then to the presentation of self in everyday life, which is clearly about the audience. He goes to stigma, where it's about internalizing the view the audience has of me, and it's internalizing a negative view. All of those, when you look at it, you say, wow, okay. Goffman, as you work through that progression, you work down this progression here, you start to say, all right, that's how you end up with a discourse, his discourse on the dramaturgical concept of looking at society. The dramaturgical approach is looking at Goffman's work. Good example of it. Analyzing the content of his work and where he goes with it, how it's put in terms of society, the notion of labeling theory. This stuff all gets at where we are today when we look at societal reaction theory. When we look at this and say societal reaction theorists and what it's about, we see these sorts of things. So it's, and how do I get here? There we go. So as a grounded approach, let's tie it back now to where we started off before. As a grounded approach, you get this idea of who presents what to whom. I'm curious. The key point for a grounded approach to research is just curiosity. The thing that I'm hoping you do in courses, but if you find a course you really like, you get curious about it, you go read about it, the idea that you want to learn it. Societal reaction theory makes sense of that, and it is the idea that you're curious. The curiosity is the key to grounded approach. That's what makes it work. You start to then ask, so then you look at societal reaction and you look at society, and this is what research does for social research. We start to look and say, what's normal for this group of people, small group, big group, society, culture? What's normal? Why is it normal? Who judges it normal? Do the people inside judge it as normal? Or have they just adopted it as a belief and they haven't thought about it? Who gets to determine that it's normal? At what point did the word normal come into play? When did we accept it or not? When did what was normal shift to be no longer normal? The norms have changed. So that's what social research is about, is looking at this. And societal reaction theory, I think, is a key place to look at that. It's a key way of looking at trying to figure out those ideas of normal, what it's about, why, and it's thinking about it in terms of why it's there. So Goffman, just to come back to it a bit, and then we'll break there, is the idea that he takes a present situation, historical context. He calls it frame analysis. I call it discourse analysis, when you look at the way it's gone on. Social mechanisms that lead one way to another, why did they come out? We start to see codes, rules, rewards, mores. When you see the word more, morality in sociology, it is not right or wrong. It is not religious morality. It is just a sense of norms, what people believe are norms, and those norms will change over time. So you start to see it. He brings in this idea of morality, even within a psychiatric facility. The morality of looking after each other, how you help each other to present in front of the bosses or the people with power, so that you can go outside, so that you don't get locked up. Trying to help each other to sort of get through their day. So the individual activity plays out. That's social research. Identifying the activities. So this is what we did, the idea of what I had to do in observations. What are the activities? What are the social roles? And then how do they play out? Because you establish in that this baseline of activity. And from those baselines, if you're a symbolic interactionist, you would start to see symbolic meaning in it. Key shaking, the sound of the keys coming down the hall or in the door. The keys represent power to the inmates, because people that have keys can decide whether we're allowed out. So it represents power, and it means I need to put on a performance. Or you might, from watching particular activities and roles, you might start to understand, there's a phenomenon here. The teacher at the front of the room, the priest, the imam, the the rabbi, the social leader, the person that is the MC at an event, whoever it is that guides people and leads them to something, you start to say, oh, you might see that as a phenomenon, as opposed to a symbol you might recognize as a phenomenon because you lean more to that particularly theoretical place. So I think that's a good place to cut off, because the next bit